All right, one take Drake. We fucking got this. Let's go. Hi everyone, Cody Hollyfield here from Mermaids and Martians, and it's time for an album review. Okay, that's what we're here for. Of the new Cise Greeny, look, I'm sorry bro for butchering your name, album, Grass Mask. So, Cise Greeny, he's an underground MC from Queens. To be honest, I'm not really familiar with a lot of his work prior to Grass Mask. I've only really checked it out because I found this alternate cover art that seemed to be, you know, like MF Doom inspired. And honestly, whenever you listen to this thing, there is an obvious Doom influence in the word choice and in the ad-libs. And the track Keep It Going even goes as far as to insert an interview snippet from the man himself on why he chose to wear the mask. And it's obvious that the production on this thing took a lot of inspiration from Doom's collaborators as well. But don't get it twisted, because Cise Greeny is not a Doom clone or a Doom ripoff. Yeah, sure, he's wearing his influences on his sleeve, but he's modifying the style, modernizing it ever so slightly. I would say that this album does have a classic feel, though. It is obviously nostalgic for the time where Doom was in the underground changing the landscape. Now, this record is pretty lo-fi, it's pretty rough around the edges, and that sound, that style may not be to everyone's liking, but for anyone who wants to stick around and just embrace that aesthetic, you will see that there is a wealth of talent on this record. Cise Greeny is obviously a very talented lyricist, and his producers, they know what they're doing as well. Now, that being said, that isn't to say that this album is perfect. There are times when I think Greeny's word choice is a little corny, and I think his word choice is a little too obvious, and although I do love the ad-libs on this thing, there are times when I think they become a little too overbearing, and I think that there are times when the main vocal line gets lost in the mix. But to be fair, I don't think the ad-libs necessarily take away from the charm, and especially with the former, fortunately those moments are few and far between. Greeny manages to have funny lines and witty quotables throughout this entire project. Take for instance the track SCRAMBLER'S Story, which has an obvious Kanye influence in its production. Master lock the pot, might cook up a proper cop. Oh my god. Or later on in the track when he says, I'm done saying good morning, cause we ain't morning. I think I like that line a little bit more than I probably should. We begin the whole thing with these luscious guitar chords. Oh my god, they're delicious. They're supported by these arpeggiated bells. The whole thing is super lush, super heavenly. And then whenever we transition into By Your Side, there seems to also be some Kanye influence on this track as well. There is obviously some elements of Chipmunk soul. And as soon as he starts rapping, he just begins to go off the lyrical deep end. But that being said, his delivery is still very low key. And I think it sets the tone of the whole record immaculately, because it feels very personal and very intimate. Greeny shows that he isn't very, well, showy. But as I mentioned before, he is still a very talented lyricist. The track SCRAMBLER'S Story is a great track with these complex internal rhymes. He opens the track with a lot of talking and not rapping necessarily, and it's almost as if he's talking to himself. And he does this on a lot of the tracks. Now, the chorus is again not very showy, but Greeny actually does some singing. As I mentioned before, this track has the witty lines, the quotables, and it shows that lyricism on its own can stand without the larger-than-life personality behind it. And it gives that Doom interview later on in the album much more significance. Production for this track and pretty much every track on this album is wonky and off-kilter, and I think you can see this in a track like In a Day, which happens to be a lot more guitar forward and sees some gorgeous piano licks, but with the drums in particular, they're not perfectly placed, they're not perfectly orchestrated, and I mean that in the best possible way. It's obvious that there isn't a lot of quantization, and it's as if Greeny and his producers just went off of the feeling of the track rather than these perfectly sequenced rhythms, obviously taking some Dilla influence here. The track 3 Ply feels like something that would be on a Madlib project, and considering Madlib's talent, that is 100% a compliment towards Godfingers, who had actually released a series of beat tapes last year, and I would recommend checking all of them out as well. There are a bunch of just really odd samples placed throughout this entire track, and I just love this because it is just some very raw boom bap. I really do love the track At the Armory. It begins with a series of like warbled sounds. It sounds like it's like being reversed. Either way, super weird. And then Greeny, for whatever reason, just decides to rap on top of this instrumental. I don't know who would want to rap on that, let alone try to, but it works out in his favor, and he just does not stop on this track, giving us bar after bar after bar after bar. I'm gonna try to read them in my Sondheim best. Knowledgeable power, tower defenses, mechanisms getting bent, rockin' jade stones, playing the throne, praying I make it home, late nights feeling chrome off the dome. God, what the fuck is this track? Oh my god. This thing is so weird, but I'm so glad that Greeny has decided to embrace those weird qualities of his music. The flow is very off kilter, super wobbly, and it completely fits alongside this very weird instrumental. The track Oven Roast is a very mellow dose of lo-fi hip-hop. Look, in a different context, before I dropped out, I'd probably be studying to this. The tracks Faith and Get It Right have very similar sample work. They both featured these repeating chopped up vocals, and Faith seems to go a step further, chopping up these siren-esque melodies. I assume they're still vocal lines, but regardless, they sound like sirens. And you have these lush piano chords supporting that sample. And then on Get It Right, my favorite line happens to be, I felt pain and I graced it like Mick Foley. And as a wrestling fan, I appreciated that one. The track Nameplate, I think, is probably the weakest track towards the end. It is the shortest track on the project, so this isn't to say that it overstays its welcome, but it does kind of end before it really should, especially since Greeny does his normal talking intro. There is some great lyricism in the mix, but there are times when it leaves a bit to be desired. Out of all the great production on this record, I think this might be the weakest beat out of all of them, just in my personal opinion. But even still, with this being the weakest track of the bunch, there are things of note. Yeah, it kind of says something about the quality of the record. I kind of like this line where it says, let it go for better than holding on. I'm in the eye of the storm. I never mean any harm. The track ERMAC is probably my favorite lyrically, and it sees Greeny delivering, a little bit of braggadocio. My book of rhymes like Enoch, lift you like ERMAC, paralyze your mind though the spirit never turns back. Oh, there's too many. There's too many quotables. There's too many witty lines. I love it. This guy produces more bars than a Hershey factory. I don't get it. Towards the beginning of the track, we hear this snippet of a lady talking over what seems to be New York traffic. And honestly, what this track feels like is as if we happened upon Greeny in the middle of the street just freestyling. And the whole thing ends with the track Puzzled, which I think closes the album rather well. It feels a lot more upbeat, a lot more triumphant compared to the other tracks. Now, this beat sounds very nostalgic, and it reminds me of Biggie's Juicy, but almost as if you warped it and you just threw it in a blender. It again features those off-kilter drums, and I think he honestly leaves this whole thing pretty open-ended. It feels like, he's not setting this as the end, but rather just a chapter in a hopefully very, very, very long book, because what I'm getting right now, I'm very interested in it and I'm loving it. Over this review, you've probably noticed that I've said the word inspiration, inspired, influenced multiple times. And while he does wear his influences on his sleeve, it never feels like he's making B-sides or leftovers of any of the artists that he is taking from. So yeah, I think this threads the needle, because at the end of the day, Greeny is making some pretty interesting music, and it's music that I haven't really heard in a long time. It's not music that it's definitely not music that I'm hearing now. But yeah, this was pretty great. I really, really love this thing. I'm feeling a decent to strong 8 on this thing. What did you think about the new
Cise Greeny
album? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Did you even listen to it? If you didn't, what are you doing with your life? You got to listen to it. I'll put a link down in the description below. Thank you all for watching. I hope you all have a great one.